Good morning. My name is Karen Nelson. I'm co-director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies and director of research initiatives here in the Department of English at the University of Maryland. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you as we celebrate the recent publication of Laura Rosenthal's book, Ways of the World, Theater and Cosmopolitanism in the Restoration and Beyond. In a couple of minutes, I'll put the order info and discount code in the chat. But first, I want to introduce our speakers and take care of a couple of housekeeping items. First, I want to alert you that the first part of this session, as Professor Rosenthal provides an overview of the book, is being recorded. Second, I need to offer land acknowledgements. This version from a recent Book Lab CLCS event seemed especially apt. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the University of Maryland Center for Literary and Comparative Studies, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Laura Rosenthal. She is professor of English. She has authored Infamous Commerce, Prostitution in 18th Century Literature and Culture from Cornell in 2006, Playwrights and Plagiarists in Early Modern Drama, Gender, Authorship, Literature, Property from Cornell in 1996, and has edited Nightwalkers, Prostitute Narratives from the 18th Century, Broadview, 2008, with Donna Hyland, Literary Study, Measurement, and the Sublime, Disciplinary Assessment from the Teagle Foundation in 2011, and with Meena Chowdhury, Monstrous Dreams of Reason, Body, Self, and Other in Enlightenment from Bucknell in 2002. She has won numerous awards, including a Newbery British Academy Award for Research in Great Britain, the Monticello College Foundation Fellowship for Study at the Newberry Library, an NEH Summer Award, and a Folger Shakespeare Library Short-Term Fellowship. Professor Rosenthal recently served as the Advanced Professor for the College of Arts and Humanities. She is currently Director for Faculty Leadership in the Office of Faculty Affairs and editor of the journal Restoration. Scott Trudell, who is the Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies here in the Department of English, specializes in early modern poetry, drama, music, and pageantry, as well as media studies and performance theory. His first book, Unwritten Poetry, Song, Performance, and Media in Early Modern England, is available from Oxford University Press with a 30% discount. And I'll put that link and discount code in the chat as well. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you all so much for coming. I just thought I would tell you a little bit about the book, since I'm guessing nobody's had a chance to read it. Maybe you've read it already, but it's recently out. And also, since I'm not actually like coming up for tenure or promotion, nobody's forcing the department to read it. So here it is. Let's see. Okay. So the book is about the Restoration as a cosmopolitan moment. And I think that's something that pretty much everybody that we all know about, but I took this opportunity to kind of take a deeper dive into that idea. Like, what does it mean to be cosmopolitan? What does it mean that it's a cosmopolitan moment? So when Charles II was restored to the throne, English elite had a great admiration for other empires, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Ottoman, and the Chinese empires, and some degree of envy, as lots of other studies in the field have shown. So Charles started investing in navigation. Alok Yadav has written about how there was a sense of inferiority among English writers for their literary production. So that was part of the mode too of the Restoration, and a competition for refinement and sophistication. So so for Charles II, having a great theater was part of this competition to be more to compete with other nations in cosmopolitanism. And so the Restoration Theater, as many of you here like really know very well, was different from what came before. Probably the biggest change is women as actresses, but also this new genre called heroic drama, which I actually talk a lot about in the book, and movable scenery. So it was a much more visual theater, and it was a much more maybe kind of more of an elite theater than Shakespeare's. So on the political side, this was a period that's often, the economic system is often called mercantilism. But I went with this phrase that I got from a historian named Sven Beckert called war capitalism, which actually seems to me to more accurately describe what was going on, because trade is like, feels to me like a bit of a euphemism, because all of this economic activity was enabled by a military infrastructure. And so there were conflicts over the Dutch for trade. There was a fear of France because France had a very powerful empire, and of course Catholicism, but also the king was in a secret alliance with the French king. So there was split within England. There was conflict with the Spanish in the Caribbean. There was an attempt to establish Tangier as an outpost in the Mediterranean. And in the midst of all this, Charles chartered the Company of Royal Adventurers trading in Africa, which eventually emerged in 1672 as the Royal African Company, which was a key part of empire building in the Restoration, and also very much connected to the royals and the elite because it was a monopoly. So why try to think about theater in these terms? So first of all, Charles II was a big supporter of theater. Theater became associated with sophistication and power. There was actually less censorship of theater than there was of other genres than of print genres, partly because Charles just liked it, and the whole elite culture really loved going to theater. So I think they could get away with more. And it did have a kind of association with the elite because, of course, it was disparaged by by Cromwell's government. So it was an opportunity for lavish display and social mixing. If you read Pepys's diary, he's always talking, he has like one line about the play, and then he talks about who's there and, you know, who he talked to and who's sitting next to whom. And so it had that part of it as well. So on the other side, I think theater is really interesting in the Restoration because I believe that playwrights were able to get away with more criticism than other writers at the time could. And they were attached to the court, and they were very aware of the international politics. So I think there are a lot of references in plays that the audience would have understood that kind of, you know, escape us pretty easily. So I tried to go into those and kind of pull those out. And the audience, of course, was itself sophisticated and aware of these political conflicts and international global scene. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's inside the book. So there's a chapter on Davenant's siege of Rhodes and the admiration of the Ottoman Empire. So they were both envious and admiring of the Ottoman Empire. I use Gerald McLean's phrase, empire envy, to describe what was going on. And by the way, I just should mention that this work benefits from so many other people who have done like particular studies of relationships with certain areas like China, the New World, the Ottoman Empire, the French, the Spanish. And instead of, originally I was thinking I would go all the way up to the 18th century, but I got so stuck in like all the various directions that people were looking in the Restoration that I just stayed there and decided to try to do like a panoramic view of all the different investments. So the fop emerges as we know from Chris Straub's work, a figure of sexuality in the Restoration and 18th century, but I think he's also a figure of failed cosmopolitanism, which actually demonstrates the significance of true cosmopolitanism, because they repeat this joke over and over and over again of people who kind of think they're cosmopolitanism who aren't, and that's the fop, and his gender identity is part of that, which I talk a little bit about as well. So it wasn't just male figures. There's also a kind of trope in the Restoration comedy about country girls who become sophisticated. So it's a narrative that is also paralleled in actress biographies, which are often about, started out in this little town and went to the big city and became sophisticated. So sophisticated in the 17th century, the word itself basically meant polluted. It wasn't really a favorable term, but over the course of the 18th century, it came to mean what we think of it as now, as kind of complexity, like as a good thing, intellectual complexity. But during the Restoration in the 18th century, the word itself was not always a compliment, and the kind of fallout of becoming sophisticated was often traced through women, through female figures, as the fop sort of did for male figures. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but I'm also interested in the Indian queens on stage, and in particular, the queen who brought the Indies. I discuss Congreve's play, The Morning Pride, and the enslaved African queen, Zara. And this was Congreve's most popular play in the 18th century. It played constantly throughout the 18th century. Nobody's heard of it now. Everybody's heard of, the comedies, but nobody's really heard of, nobody pays much attention to The Mourning Bride. And so I talk about kind of why everybody just loved it in the 18th century. And it was like the plum role for actresses. They all wanted to play Zara, and Sarah Siddons played Zara at the end of the century. And yet it's kind of a narrative that we've kind of forgotten about. And so I wanted to think about why it had such a profound effect on people then, and not anymore. So then there's a kind of section that's like the post-Restoration revisionist history. How did the Merry Monarch lose its irony as a descriptor? So people refer to Charles as the Merry Monarch, but of course the original couplet is, restless he rolls about from whore to whore, a merry monarch, scandalous and poor. So like it wasn't a compliment, but it's kind of become like, it became a compliment in the 18th century in certain ways. So I want to talk about how that shift in what the Restoration was changed in the 18th century. And I think Colley Cibber is a key part of it. And so then there's a post-Restoration chapter on Adam Smith, who relies on theater as a source for analysis of human emotion in theory of moral sentiment. And then his Wealth of Nations, which is inspired by The Spectator as kind of a Whig cosmopolitanism that takes from the Tory cosmopolitanism of the Restoration and makes it acceptable in a Whig context. And there's a discussion of the play, The London Merchant, in that context. So often when I was submitting my second book, one of the criticisms I got was like, what's your approach? Which was really hard for me to articulate. So I really kind of thought about it for this one. And so I'll just say that it's very historical and contextual. There's an attention to performance, but it isn't exactly performance studies because it's really about theater. It's not about performances, much about performances that take place outside of the theater. I've assumed that some things that we have to dig for would have been obvious to original audiences, and those are some of the things that I'm trying to go back and pull up for us to consider. Um, I do discuss the disparaged, apparently frivolous and aspirational elite version of cosmopolitanism, as well as the ideal and discrepant kind. But really, I'm trying to sort of take a deeper dive into the bad kind. I know everybody else wants to talk about the other kinds, but this is the bad one. So I breed for literal, metaphorical, unstated, but also emotional meanings. And so I've made an attempt to historicize emotional meanings, by which I mean that I don't assume that people in the Restoration had the same emotional response to plays that I do. Otherwise, the popularity of The Mourning Bride is just completely baffling. So instead, so I want to think about like what were they seeing in that play that we don't see anymore. I think the Restoration playwrights themselves were dependent, by which I mean they were dependent on royal patronage and dependent on making money. But at the same time, they were politically engaged, they were resistant, and they were also very insightful. So I take them often as my guide for insights. So now I'm just going to give you like a little taste of chapter 3, which is about the queen who brought the Indies and Dryden's Indian queen plays. But I'm going to talk less about the plays than about the actual queen, who doesn't get much attention. So one thing I argue is that the marriage between Catherine of Braganza and Charles II was a very significant moment in the emergence of an imperial culture and an imperial mindset and expansionism. So, of course, Catherine was Portuguese, and the Portuguese were the first Europeans to sell African people, and they also had a very wide trade network. So Catherine's dowry included Tangier, Bombay, and access to slave forts, which were built and owned by the Portuguese and defended by the Dutch. And that was sort of behind the scenes of a lot of the Dutch wars, was fights over these slave forts. Catherine, through her dowry, helped popularize tea, porcelain, lacquer, cotton, cane, calico. And these were all things that she was used to from living in Portugal, but English people hadn't quite yet gotten into them. So I'd be like, everything you associate with being quintessentially English is like from somewhere else. Tea, porcelain, all these things that we think of as symbols of being English. So there's an unconfirmed rumor that I want to, that I thought was really interesting, that the phrase sugar and spice and everything nice is said to refer to Catherine, who was small, what are little girls made of, and also because her dowry was paid by Portugal with bags of sugar from their Brazilian plantations, which, believe me, did not make Charles happy, because they wanted money, but she was like the equivalent of sugar herself. So that's why she was made of sugar. And so this is the image I chose for my cover, which is called a marriage box or a work box. And it is stump embroidery, which means that like it sticks out. And so, and I found this image really interesting because it's not a famous painting. It's just like somebody's personal work, and it's celebrating the marriage of Charles and Catherine. But as you can see, there's a figure of an enslaved child right there, which to me kind of suggests that there was a popular understanding of the slave trade being part of what was going on in this marriage contract. So now I want to talk a little bit about Catherine herself, because actually, if you go to the library and you can find like 400 books on Nell Gwyn, but there is actually like no study in English that's a scholarly study of Catherine of Braganza. And so there was a rumor that she was herself of mixed blood, and it was believed that the Portuguese royals mixed with the Moors. And so I connect this to the fascination on the Restoration stage with all of these exoticized women in the heroic tragedies, which those of you who are familiar with those plays will know about them, but there were lots of them. So some people have thought that these women referred to Charles as mistresses, but I actually think it makes more sense that they refer to the queen. So of course we don't know what she really looked like, but John Evelyn described her skin as olivander, which means deep olive. And there's a play by Edward Howard called The Woman's Conquest in 1670, which is really obviously about Catherine because it's about a king who really shouldn't be having sex with lots of other women and should go home and behave himself, which there were lots of plays like that to try to get the king to go home and produce an heir because there were no royal heirs. But it's just interesting that this Catherine figure is disguised as a Moor for most of the play. And there's also kind of a belief in the field that female actresses never went in blackface, but it actually kind of seems like there's textual evidence that whoever played it, because there's a lot of reference to her black skin in the play and to her putting on some sort of something that makes her skin black. So I don't know, there's clearly more thought about that, but I speculate about that one. So I see I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm just going to mention that there were a lot when Catherine and Charles were married, there were a lot of poems written to celebrate the marriage, and this is the one in the first poem that says, that basically the marriage will make Charles, if you just look at the last line, will make him be the master of the Indies too. And that was the belief about this marriage, that it was going to give Charles this expanded empire. And then when Charles died, this is part of a memorial poem to him, that as I'll just read this. As a dowry brought to England more, that's Catherine, more than any queen that ever came before, she placed the English arms upon the Afric shore, 1685. So that's that was in right after the death of Charles. So in closing, I'm just going to fast forward to the 20th century to an artist named Audrey Flack, who created a statue of Catherine that was supposed to be erected in Queens, New York. And some people say that Queens is named after her, some people don't, I don't know. But the artist depicted Catherine as a woman of color, and Flack in her website says that she modeled Catherine on her own biracial cousin, hoping the statue would inspire ethnic and multiracial women. So there's some photos of the work in progress of the Catherine statue that was intended for Queens, and the scale of it. There's a little one. So here, the only one that was built was this one that's in Lisbon, because local protesters objected that Catherine, to have a statue of Catherine because of her involvement in slave ownership. They said that she was a owner of slaves. It seems like she was actually, there isn't historical evidence that she personally owned slaves, but I do think that she did play a key role, as I've suggested, in the slave trade, although she didn't necessarily play it deliberately. She was kind of a pawn being traded between two nations, but it was a crucial alliance that led to the formation of the Royal African Company. So of that big statue that you saw, the pieces were all melted down because of the controversy. And this little one is in Portugal. And so there are all these plays in the Restoration that are what I call mixed marriages. Other people have called them miscegenation, but I like the term mixed marriages because the mixed marriage is often the solution rather than the problem. It's kind of what the play wants to happen. And so I think a lot of these plays were working through the meaning of this marriage that was thought of culturally in the Restoration as itself a mixed marriage. And it was exploring the meaning of the marriage of Charles and Catherine and of English imperial identity as it was emerging in the Restoration period. So in closing, just kind of a thumbnail sketch. These are two women who had sex with Charles II. Probably the most famous is Nell Gwyn, and the least famous is actually Catherine. So I'm hoping to change that, and hoping that we can think about the Restoration through Catherine as much as we think about it through Nell Gwyn. So thank you. I'm delighted for questions. I'm honored for everyone who attended, and I will stop sharing and turn it over to Scott.